It began quietly. No emergency address, no dramatic signing ceremony, just a policy notice that, within hours, froze immigrant visa processing for citizens of 75 countries. On paper, it looked procedural. In reality, it sent a shock through migration networks, remittance flows, and diplomatic corridors worldwide. When Donald Trump made the call, many dismissed it as another immigration headline. But this was not about tourists or students. This was about permanent entry, about who gets to build a future inside the world's largest economy and who does not. Nearly a third of the world suddenly found one of its most important doors partially shut. The common belief is that visa rules are domestic politics. The hidden truth is that visas are leverage. They decide labor supply, talent competition, family capital flows, and demographic power. In an era of slowing growth, rising debt, and geopolitical fragmentation, mobility itself has become an asset. And timing matters. This move arrives amid global uncertainty, election pressure at home, and renewed emphasis on economic nationalism. It signals something larger than border control, a recalibration of how the United States uses access as influence. So the real question isn't what changed on paper, it's why now, and what this decision reveals about where power is moving next. Headlines made it sound like America slammed its borders shut overnight. That is not what happened. Tourist visas, student visas, short-term business travel, those channels remain open. What was frozen was immigrant visa processing, a far narrower but far more consequential mechanism. An immigrant visa is not a plane ticket, it is a pipeline. It governs family reunification cases that can take years, employment-based green cards that feed high-skill sectors, and diversity pathways that shape long-term demographics. When processing stops, the queue does not disappear. It hardens. Families remain separated. Firms lose future workers. Demographic inflows slow months before anyone feels it. This is why the policy hides behind bureaucracy. To the public, it looks technical. To the economy, it is structural. Immigration flows don't move like headlines. They move like supply chains, with delays, bottlenecks, and cascading effects. Recent guidance makes this clearer. Consulates pause new immigrant cases. Reviews are extended, exemptions narrowed. Nothing dramatic on the surface, everything consequential underneath. So, when critics and supporters argue past each other, they miss the point. This wasn't a loud ban. It was a calibrated choke point. And if something so technical can reshape labor, families, and leverage, the real question becomes unavoidable. The official explanation sounds technical, even reasonable. The administration points to public charge rules, arguing that the immigration system must prioritize self-sufficiency. Officials warn of overstretched welfare systems, administrative backlogs, and the need to reassess risk. Framed this way, the freeze appears defensive, almost managerial, a pause to protect fiscal stability. But that is only the surface logic. Beneath it lies a different calculus. Immigration policy is one of the few tools that speaks simultaneously to markets, voters, and foreign governments. By tightening access, Donald Trump signals resolve to a domestic audience that equates control with strength. To bureaucracies, it restores hierarchy. To other states, it converts mobility into bargaining power. This is not a humanitarian argument. It is an economic filter. Who enters shapes wage pressure, tax bases, innovation capacity, and long-term demographics. Controlling that flow is a form of statecraft. The louder debate about morality masks the quieter reality of governance. Political timing reinforces this interpretation. Announced amid fiscal strain and electoral pressure, the policy speaks to reassurance, not reform. It tells anxious voters the system is being managed, even if the costs appear later. Once viewed through this lens, the move stops looking reactive. It looks deliberate. And history suggests this logic is neither new nor temporary. It is the language of power dressed as procedure, a pause that functions less as caution and more as control in moments of uncertainty and transition. This logic has precedent. The United States has repeatedly tightened immigration not during prosperity, but during stress. In the late 19th century, restrictions followed industrial turbulence. During the Great Depression, borders hardened as jobs vanished. After World War II, openness returned, not from idealism, but from economic necessity. Immigration policy has always moved with the cycle. When growth accelerates, doors open to labor and talent. When pressure builds, access narrows. This rhythm is often forgotten because America sells itself as permanently open, a nation defined by arrival. In practice, openness has been conditional. What matters is not the rule itself, but the moment it appears. Restrictions tend to surface before structural shifts, slowing productivity, rising debt, or geopolitical realignment. They act as early warning signals, long before markets price in change. Seen this way, the current freeze fits a familiar pattern. It is less about the individuals affected today and more about managing tomorrow's constraints. Borders become buffers, visas become valves. Understanding this history reframes the present. This is not an anomaly. It is a cycle repeating with modern language and modern stakes. And when the United States adjusts its filters, the effects rarely stay domestic for long. Global capital, labor markets, and allied economies inevitably respond. Because American immigration policy has never been isolated from the wider system, it has always shaped global flows of opportunity and risk worldwide. The effects do not stop at America's borders. When immigrant visa pipelines freeze, labor markets across dozens of countries feel it almost immediately. Engineers, nurses, technicians, and family-sponsored migrants who once planned for U.S. entry now remain home, quietly shifting local wage pressure and employment competition. Remittance expectations weaken, removing a critical but often invisible source of foreign currency for fragile economies. For governments, this is not merely social disruption. It is strategic pressure. Access to the U.S. labor market has long acted as an informal safety valve, absorbing surplus labor and exporting economic stress. When that valve tightens, states must absorb the strain internally. And this is where leverage appears. Visa access becomes a bargaining chip, rarely announced, but clearly understood. Cooperation is rewarded with flexibility. Resistance meets delay. On the global chessboard, incentives shift. Talent flows slow toward the United States and redirect elsewhere, reshaping innovation hubs and regional influence. Rivals see openings, allies reassess dependency. The human cost is immediate and visible in stalled families and postponed futures. The strategic gain is quieter, influence without force, pressure without sanctions. This is power exercised through process. And while much of the pain lands abroad, the consequences do not stay external. Reduced inflows inevitably circle back, reshaping conditions inside the United States itself. Here lies the central contradiction. The United States restricts immigration at a moment when labor shortages persist, demographics are aging, and productivity growth is fragile. Entire sectors, from healthcare to advanced manufacturing, rely on immigrant labor pipelines that function years in advance. Freezing those pipelines does not solve shortages, it delays them. In the short term, the policy offers political clarity. It signals control, discipline, and protection. Wages appear defended, pressure feels contained, but economies do not run on signals alone. Over time, fewer workers mean tighter labor markets, higher costs, and slower expansion. Innovation suffers when talent inflows narrow. Demographics worsen quietly, long before headlines appear. This raises the deeper question: is this economic nationalism, or is it controlled scarcity by design? Limiting access can increase bargaining power for domestic labor and the state itself, but only if the system absorbs the trade-offs. Scarcity can protect, but it can also choke growth. The audience is left to judge. Is this policy defending the economy from strain or postponing structural problems into the future? And if the costs are delayed while the benefits are immediate, the timing of this decision begins to matter more than the decision itself. Why does this decision land in early 2026 and not before or later? In political economy, timing is rarely accidental. Election cycles sharpen incentives, fiscal pressures narrow room for error, and global instability makes control feel more valuable than openness. At home, immigration has reemerged as a proxy issue, standing in for anxiety about wages, identity, and economic security. Acting now allows the administration to demonstrate decisiveness before uncertainty compounds. It is governance as reassurance. Abroad, conflict zones remain unresolved, supply chains are still fragile, and capital flows are volatile. In that environment, states prefer levers they can pull quickly. Visa policy is one of them. There is also a historical pattern worth noticing. Major policy signals often arrive before structural shifts become visible. Border tightening has preceded recessions, labor market realignments, and geopolitical transitions more than once. Announcements prepare the public psychologically for change long before statistics confirm it. So this moment is less about crisis response and more about preemption. The move tells markets, voters, and allies that access will be conditional in the years ahead. It sets expectations early. which raises the forward-looking question. If this is the signal, not the destination, what other adjustments follow when mobility becomes a strategic variable rather than an assumption? Watch the timing closely. It often reveals intentions before policies unfold. This is not the end of the story. It is a signal that the era of frictionless movement is giving way to something more selective, more managed, and more strategic. For decades, globalization assumed people would follow capital and opportunity. That assumption is quietly being rewritten. What replaces it is not isolation, but filtration. States are learning to separate flows they value from those they fear. Talent, labor, and families are no longer just social categories. They are inputs in a competitive system. Mobility becomes permissioned, negotiated, and reversible. This shift extends beyond one country. As the United States recalibrates access, others will mirror, resist, or adapt. Corridors will open elsewhere. New hubs will compete. The global map of opportunity will not disappear, but it will fragment. Immigration policy, in this sense, becomes a mirror. It reflects how power now works, indirect, procedural, and often invisible until its effects accumulate. No walls need to be built for borders to harden. The question for viewers is not whether this policy is good or bad, it is what kind of world it signals. One where movement is assumed, or one where access itself is power. That distinction will define power.